Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 20 of my series on the myth of authority. We've recently been discussing the transition to a free society from the perspective of the myth of authority. Today, I'm continuing the discussion where we examine how things will look in the decades ahead as the myth of authority erodes. This will be based on the most previous episodes, and I'm taking that groundwork for granted here. So fair warning, if you haven't listened to the whole series yet, a lot of this can raise eyebrows. That's why I've linked to the start of the series, and I'd encourage you to review all the episodes if you want to get the foundation of the discussions. But in a very compressed nutshell, here's how we've gotten to this stage of the transition to a free society. The myth of political authority has in recent years begun a very slow process of erosion. The myth of authority is the root cause of statism, so its erosion will impact statism. That's because as the myth erodes, people's behavior shifts to reflect that. In total, this alters the general environment for statism. So for example, up until very recently, a very favorable environment existed for statism, thanks to the impenetrable myth of authority. Contrast that with today, where we see the myth of authority showing signs of eroding, and thereby the general environment is slowly becoming less favorable for statism. Now the state, of course, is merely people, and actually the only meaningful people employed by the state are who I call the bullies, the enforcers and the politicians. That's the people who are physically armed, the enforcers, plus the people who have the legal right to call out the enforcers, mostly politicians. Notice how this excludes most of the people in government. The rest are not the bullies. They are not armed with government guns and do not have the authority to call out the enforcers. They're the vast majority working for the state, by the way. I call them the clerks. The population of actual bullies, enforcers plus politicians, is pretty small. In the United States, only about 3 million. This small set of people is what I mean by the state when I use the term. They are the ones who respond to the environment influenced by the myth of authority. When the myth is powerful, they are attracted to power and welcomed into power. But as the myth erodes, they are also the ones forced to deal with a changing, less welcoming environment. So put into a single sentence, the transition to a free society is the process of the myth eroding, with the bullies responding to the environment of the eroding myth. Our examinations have taken us to a few decades from now, say 20 years. The myth will have eroded further than today, so the bullies will be feeling it quite tangibly. So now we're ready to speculate how things look and feel within that environment of a further eroded myth. What's it like to be in that environment? And then we'll speculate further. We'll consider how a few more decades after that, maybe 40 years from now, the myth's erosion will have reached a point to where any bullies left will feel like the glass is genuinely cracking under their feet. They will feel so unwelcome that the final stages of statism will be in sight. Now, before I begin, a quick word about my choice of the time frames of 20 years and 40 years. Both are obviously approximations. I absolutely don't claim to have a crystal ball. So let me touch on how I arrive at those numbers. Imagine a point where we see open, tangible signs that statism is in trouble. First, consider a short period like 10 years from now. Think about all the factors we've covered in this series: the myth of authority, the psychology of statism, human nature, observable real-world dynamics, technology. actual encouraging trends we see even today, but then also ponder that things don't move in a straight line, that the myth along the way may not always erode downward and may gain back some strength. Consider all this, and at least to me, 10 years feels too optimistic. It's a tough call. The evidence and logic are sound, but the psychology of the myth is still strong. Okay, then consider a longer time frame, say 30 years. Same considerations, psychology, the real world, etc. Ponder all that, and somehow 30 years seems too long. Why? Because it pretty much requires that the positive trends already underway stall for most of the next 30 years. We've seen such rapid progress even over just the last 10 years that projecting little improvement over the next 30 seems unrealistically long. So again, this is not meant as a precise target, but 10 years seems too short, overly optimistic, and 30 years too long, overly pessimistic. 20 years simply seems more likely than the extremes. And that reasoning goes for the later stages of the transition too. I picked 40, still considering all the dynamics in play. 40 seemed reasonable, again, trying to avoid being overly optimistic, but also because anything greater seemed highly unlikely. Finally, about these targets. I am not looking at these as delineated and obvious tipping points. No, this will all be organic. In any particular year along the way, it'll always seem like the normal environment of that time period, just the way things are. It won't seem revolutionary or dangerous because everything else in life will be the same. True, plenty of people will be talking about the shift that's happening. Certainly any of us around will be. But since it will be organic, it will not be scary. Even today, we'll often say, we live in interesting times. Heck, I've heard that from adults when I was growing up. I'm sure you did too. 20, 40 years from now, they'll say that too. So let's start at about 20 years from now. There's lots to cover because so much looks different from today, white-pillingly different. Because of the further eroded myth of authority, the people, the majority, create a different environment. The bullies have to deal with that environment, and it's not at all pleasant to be a bully anymore. The handmaidens of the state are not what they were, and that's not good for the bullies either. And also, as a practical matter, governments will be feeling it in the wallet, which we'll cover. There's real ripple effects from that. And we've got the beautiful cherry on top white pill. Free societies emerging. Feels like Christmas morning, right? So let's open some presents. What does the environment look like? By that I mean, what are the predominant, commonly held views of the majority? What's in the air? Well, the emotional attachment to government is clearly waning. Why? Because most people under 70 grew up with a healthy skepticism of the state. They were indoctrinated, all right, but not like their boomer or older Gen X parents. They experienced the birth and maturing of digital media. They watched corporate media die and were left with a sense of having been propagandized by it. They lost respect for it, along with any institutions that just parroted the state. Skeptical is the one word that most broadly describes them. From there, they observed firsthand decades of government failing on promises, making things worse. Sure, the same things anyone could have seen at any point in the past, except this environment has better inoculated them from indoctrination, unlike former generations who had that self-blinding inner false fog. No, they're mostly immune from that. Remember, the myth of authority is now well along the road of its erosion. It's not standing in the way very much of seeing the world as it is. What else? The people learn to expect results, and fast, in the world they experienced. Well, government never delivered good results, and certainly not fast. So the general view of government is indifference. But that label, indifference, really is the start along a scale of feelings, all of which is in the air. Indifference extends to disregard, to mockery, even contempt. All of these are generally accepted ways people perceive the state 20 years from now. The perception of victimless crime laws will have changed, like licensing laws, drug laws, even legal tender laws. So non-compliance will not really be judged as wrong. It'll be seen as getting around an annoying obstacle. And technology itself will likely have made it far easier to get around the government's rules. If the government is still trying to crack down on enforcing them, in the air will be the understanding that when people do comply, it's from fear. You'll see far, far less of a moral obligation to comply. Another significant aspect of the environment, people will have a clearer picture of the bullies as bullies. They'll know who they are specifically. Let me break that down. Today we have the nebulous concept of government. It's this vague blob with a brain, an institution with its own free will. That's the scrambled impression people have thanks to the myth. 20 years on, that perspective of government is likely to have been replaced by a much clearer understanding that government is literally nothing but people. Government will mean how actual people behave in specific situations. For example, in a government office, they will see what the clerks do. On a video feed, they may see what a politician does. On the street, they may see what a cop does. And I realize this sounds like something they can see today. But remember, the myth fogs their judgment. Today, when they see these things, they're all lumped under the category of government, switching off further thought. Mentally, the observed behavior becomes dispersed and diluted into that collective blob. But now think about what people 20 years from now will have gotten used to in their private choices. Technology will have sparked wide decentralization. People will have gotten used to making more immediate, direct choices with direct human interactions. People will expect personalized customer support. They might communicate directly with social media content providers, with educators, writers, artists, experts across the board. Point is, they will get used to evaluating people for the value they bring personally, not their value as a collective label. Well, that works in our favor regarding government. It means people will see what government people actually do, from the local DMV type of interactions all the way up to the actions of politicians on a national scale. They'll more easily see the difference between the DMV type clerks who have no real power versus the bullies who do have the real power. Of course, they won't use those labels, bullies and clerks, but that'll be in the air. It'll be a general understanding that most of the people holding government jobs, those clerks, are just regular people. They don't really represent the state. They're just doing what they're told. But they will see cops, military, politicians as the ones with power, because they will have seen their behavior during decades of first-hand video and judge them individually. You all know that little catchphrase we libertarians and anarchists have been using forever, that the government gets what it wants at gunpoint. Well, 20 years from now, that obvious conclusion will have more become part of the environment, something everyone just knows. People will know who's doing the gun pointing, and it's not those government clerks. Instead, they'll resent the bullies who actually do use guns to get what they want. And boy, another white pill from that is they'll know just how few of them there are. Now, I'm hesitant to weigh in on how voting looks. If it's handled on paper like today, it seems very plausible voting levels will have decreased. But it's possible. Technology permits government to make voting a few simple clicks or touches on a smart device. Well, that would only undermine the idea that people see voting as valuable. All we'd know for sure is that it's easy. Anyway, with all that said, overall in the environment, we'll observe a significant erosion of the myth. Ask people if politicians and cops have moral authority over them, and many will wonder what you're talking about. And you know what that means. The bullies themselves will know it's in the air too. It feels to them like the environment is so unfriendly, they'd be fools to even be a bully. This will be a new and important stage. To the bully, the environment will be yelling at them. This is no place for you. Remember, there will have been decades under the belt of declining recruitment of police and military. So it'll be known that enforcement is a crap career, plus decades of existing enforcers retiring early or taking desk jobs, decades of that in the air now. The backing off of enforcers is no longer slow and subtle. Backing off has become normalized. As far as the politicians, even if they aren't yet quitting at the levels the enforcers are, they'll still feel how unwelcome they are. And it won't feel very safe to know their enforcers are thinning out fast. Cracking glass, my friends. It all means anyone who remains in a bully position would either be very short-sighted or supremely stupid. You almost can't even label them as super lustful for power because power doesn't feel the same in this environment. Or if it is attractive, it comes at great personal cost. So it does seem like whoever remains in the bully population at this point is even less impressive than today's bullies. And that's a pretty low bar. What about the handmaidens of the state, the corporate media, academia, banking? Let's look at them one by one, 20 years on. Corporate media. For this handmaiden, we don't have to speculate much. Traditional media is today on its deathbed. The upcoming decades will see it die outright. I guess there might be remnants of it, but that'll be more of them integrating into decentralized media. In any case, it won't have influence anymore because it won't dominate the audience. Sure, some may be scrappy enough to get decent market shares, but with fierce competition, they can't just spew propaganda. They will be true private companies beholden to consumers, not to the small number of weakening bullies. From the bullies' perspective, the state simply won't have them anymore as a tool for propaganda. I'm highly white-pilled when I ponder how the bullies won't have a ready mouthpiece to the world. It's like they actually won't have the ability to speak. Corporate media will be gone as a state support system. Media pillar collapsed. Next, academia. If current trends continue, colleges, universities, public schooling will have seriously declined in relevance. Diplomas and degrees won't mean as much because they'll have less value in the job market. Self-teaching from the internet and homeschooling is very likely to increase in quality and quantity. Advancing technology all but assures this. Their high costs will chase away their customers. Plus, government budgets will have been reined in by economic reality, so less money for education. So academia will be an ineffective handmaiden of the state 20 years from now, withering on the vine. Another propaganda tool for the bullies, all but extinct. Another pillar of statism, gone. How about banking? Their status a few decades from now is dicey. Today, they're joined at the hip with the state. That's worked for them up to now. But as the state erodes, banking starts to feel it just like the media and academia feel it. But they feel it like being between a rock and a hard place. They can't favor alternative currencies. Their partnership with the state would be over because they couldn't fund every imaginable bully project anymore. That'd be the end of traditional banking. They can't have that. They'll have to stick with the status quo. Don't permit foreign currencies or alternative currencies to compete with the dollar. Problem is, you can't force the status quo. You can't force the US dollar to stay dominant. Even today, other currencies are in competition. Even crypto is slowly integrating into financial life. Yep, economic reality is inescapable. Just today's government debts are a train wreck in progress. So more of the same for the next 20 years? It's incomprehensible. The state will be able to fund itself in US dollars. So status quo is still death for banking. I like it. A nice rock and hard place white pill. The banking pillar of the state, doomed either way. So overall, a very white pill outlook for the pillars of statism. The corporate media, basically just a headstone. Academia, cracking. Banking, a rotting corpse or a vegetable on life support. The three major pillars all but gone. Now, what's the environment look like from the operational perspective of the bullies? This one is deliciously tangible. As I suggested, at minimum, the financial picture for the state is worse. It's been forced to cut back. We can't know by how much, but whatever amounts have to get cut, governments will feel it. Which governments? Probably the ones with the least influence politically. My guess would be the federal departments that don't help as much in keeping people indoctrinated, plus less federal fundings to the various states in the United States, especially small and mid-sized states, the ones least important to the federal government. So at the state level, agencies will suffer like health, transportation, education, housing, and of course, law enforcement. That includes county and city agencies, of course. For all those hapless agencies, money for budgets will be drying up. So some government offices will shrink or give up particular functions or just close. An unpleasant aspect of those bullies' environments, their diminished ability to maintain themselves operationally. So more employee dissatisfaction, more public dissatisfaction, and ironically, more feeling of resentment by them for the federal bullies at the top. Nice dynamic. But the dynamic continues. Suppose the sorry government office has a genuinely useful purpose, like a fire or ambulance service. Here is where private alternatives will see the open door to fill in the gaps. Now, I want you to think about what I just said. So I'll restate it. The very fact of government having less to spend leads to agencies cutting back services, and the truly important services would necessarily have to get replaced privately. You know what that is? It's the physical proof, the real-world aspect of the transition to a free society. It's what most libertarians have often thought of as the transition, the so-called dismantling of the state. But here we see it's not planned, which is how the libertarians often picture it. Top-down is how they see it happening, as if libertarian thinkers are taking over and overseeing the replacing of public agencies with private. Nope, it'll be the state backing off because the environment no longer supports them, and private businesses naturally filling in where needed. Well, the dynamic of government belt-tightening has even more goodies to offer. The state will have to deprioritize some functions just because of their sheer inability to fund them. And a whole lot of those will be what? Enforcing regulations. Yep, a change in the environment of regulatory enforcement. Nice, because the other players in the game, the majority, reap the benefit. It'll get easier to disregard taxes and regulations, with the government easing up on enforcement. People who were too scared to violate regulations are going to sense the green light as they realize there's nothing to fear. And of course, that only helps advance the erosion of the myth of authority. Regulations become something to ignore as a matter of natural course. Then we have the free territories, actual free societies here and there, establishing or established, not just purely experimental, but real-world, fledgling anarchist societies. Now today, one of the impediments to this is government itself. They're well-funded and powerful enough to nip them in the bud. But 20 years from now, the bullies will be seen more as bullies. Pushing people around, especially people who aren't bothering anyone else, will be noticed more clearly. And besides, government's dwindling finances will give them bigger fish to fry. So think of it. Free societies out there, making news, inspiring entrepreneurs, and the bullies too weak to propagandize us against them. Wow. So all of that describes how things should look. Combine all ingredients and really get yourself into the head of a bully. Breathe in his environment. Your ancestor bullies back in 2025 had the confidence of a solid myth holding them up. They had an abundant supply of enforcers at the ready, holding them up. They had 3 pillars, media, academia, and banking, holding them up. 20 years from now, what's holding you up? Your government offices all over have shrunk. Private alternatives have replaced them. The people, oh boy, the people, they're not feeling your legitimacy anymore. A very inhospitable reality of your environment. You're in trouble. Those cracks that have formed were tolerable when they were just chips and dings. And anyway, the glass was supported by those solid pillars. Now, there's cracks everywhere and nothing much underneath. Ouch. So when we assemble all these environmental pieces, it's as obvious as seeing a puzzle picture from its pieces. The myth of authority has eroded significantly. If I had to guess, I'd say there's only a lingering sense among the people about government, a lingering aura that there's supposed to be some reason government has relevance. You might say the myth is hanging in there but drying up. What this does to the environment is simple. Makes it just plain bad news for people who want to boss others around. The environment has gotten less and less hospitable. And yet, government is still around. Remember another lesson from this series. Sure, ideally, the myth of authority is overcome. Ideally, people see government as illegitimate the way we anarchists do, fully and completely, but not during the transition. People have different levels of skepticism of the state. That's why we call it a transition. The population as a whole is only partly there, not wholly. Partly means some lingering belief in authority, and that still sustains the state. Gladly a weakening state, but still a state. Now, even with all that said about the progress of the transition, remember I am referring to a general and average description of these trends. In reality, though, we should expect progress being different depending on where you are. Today, the world's cultures have widely different perspectives on the state, which means the strength of the myth of authority differs. Use the United States as an example. Americans have a history of independence, heavily leaning toward skepticism of the state. 250 years of this in our environment. Compare that to, say, North Korea, where the myth of authority is sickeningly powerful. Now project 20 years ahead. You'd expect the myth to change differently. You could say the United States had a head start on eroding the myth. Compare that to the North Korean population. No one knows the future, but it seems unlikely. The transition to a free society kicks off there. Even if it does, it'll have a more difficult path. Using just those two examples, think about the various cultures across the planet. How independent a culture tends to be could help or hinder its progress in overcoming the myth. That would lead to differing environments in which their respective state bullies operate. So, the progress of the transition will not be uniform across the world. I've used the United States in my analysis because the myth has more to worry about here. So, we've covered the trends to 20 years from now. Now let's add an additional 2 decades, put us 40 years from now, and do nothing more than continue those trends. It'll be patently obvious the state is doomed. How's the belief doing that politicians and enforcers have moral authority over us? That gut-level emotional attachment to government is about gone. Why? People of all ages grew up skeptical of the state. Only a paltry few are left who are powerfully indoctrinated enough to swell with pride at flags or anthems. No, the majority lived and breathed the decentralized digital media world, where fads come and go quickly, where the coolest things are passé in a few years or months. Something as old, stodgy, and useless as government would have never captured the people's attention. So no, in the air is no sense of a fundamental respect for government. That environment portrays enforcers and politicians as weak, not intimidating and powerful like their image today. No, to most average people, the bullies are background noise, more or less non-existent. Their feelings toward the state are indifference and disregard. It's not even militant disregard. No, there's no need for that. The environment is that bullies are no real threat. After all, over the decades, they've backed off a whole lot. They're not worth people's time. At this point, you would not use the phrase, the myth of authority is eroding. You'd say, the myth of authority has eroded. And the bullies at this point, their environment is distinctly bully unfriendly. All through their last couple of decades, they've felt that, and they've established their own decades-long pattern of dealing with it, quitting, changing careers, basically thinning themselves out. For the bullies at this stage, It might feel less like cracking glass and more like a time bomb in its last seconds. That's why things will move rapidly at that point. And a perfect example will be the actual free societies. If at 20 years from now they were just starting to get established, then here at 40 years, it should be awesome. They'll no longer be experimental. They will have been proving grounds as anarchist societies. This is one of the biggest white pills in the transition. Every year that passes with free societies showing stability and prosperity and peace will put the lie to the claims. They devolve into lawlessness and chaos. And what do we all know about success? It's catching, it's attractive, it's a bandwagon. A few successful free societies will light a fire for a lot more. Okay, that's 40 years out with an obvious next question. When will the transition be about complete? Well, my analysis has tried to be as grounded in the real world as possible, and I feel the reasoning has been sound. Still, the longer out we look, the more speculative, so this will be another best guess. After that 40 or so year point, we'll have such a viscerally unfavorable environment for bullies that I'd say it'll take only another 10 years to see the majority of the civilized world stateless. Now, just so we're clear, it's anyone's guess how long it will take for the whole planet to get there. Remember, slavery was mostly abolished in the mid to late 1800s. Yet here we are 150 years later, and actual slavery is still around in scattered places. So why do we say slavery's been abolished? Because the whole civilized world is on board. It's been predominantly and overwhelmingly stamped out. Whatever slavery is left is shunned by the rest of us. Well, it'll be the same for statelessness. Who knows how long before it fully dies out in every single corner of the globe. But there will be a point, my guess being about 50 years, where statism will be predominantly stamped out. The state will have no place in the civilized world. So, a summary now of the transition periods. Today, and probably a good 10 years ahead, the very early stages. Here, if we want to evaluate the status of the transition, we have no choice. We must search for signs of the transition, for signs of trends. We have to do some thinking, some mental analysis. Whether the transition is actually underway is not obvious in our face. It has to be thought through. Fortunately, when we do think it through, the answer is yes, the transition is underway. The trends are indeed there, and that's exactly how it was in our historical parallel of slave abolition. At its early stages, any evidence that it was progressing was subtle and hard to spot. Okay, the next stage, some 20 years from now, things are now worse for the state and better for the transition. It's here where the sense of the transition is in the air, an environment so much worse than today for the bullies that it'll be obvious and at that tipping point. And back to our parallel in history. When the slave movement reached that stage, it was widely understood in the air that abolition had become unstoppable, a matter of time. So at 20 years, expect most people will have a sense that the state is at minimum a useless appendage, even a dying relic. For anyone who looks, it will be fairly obvious the state's clock is ticking. It won't have to be reasoned out. They'll live in a world with unmistakable outward signs of it. The environment will carry with it the sense that the state is in decline. And then we have the later stages, perhaps 40 years from now, the home stretch, when things will progress rapidly. Time to prepare a nice, rusty dustbin of history for statism. Maybe the best way to perceive it is from the majority's view. The environment they've established of the nearly eroded myth of authority has caused the state, the bullies, to effectively back off into nothingness. The majority will have long since become acclimated, very much used to, skepticism of government. It will be normalized. They got used to seeing government cut back, used to seeing the world doesn't end when government does cut back, used to seeing private alternatives replace them. In those decades, as government offices shrink or close, people will get immune to feeling concern. The environment does that for them. makes it the background of normal life. In the home stretch, the majority will do what they always do, passively follow the trends. Remember my metaphor of the majority of people as a huge ship with only the small propellers and rudders moving and steering it? By then, the ship will have already trended to a new course. The people passively shifted over those 40 years, right along with it. In the old times, their passivity to trends kept statism going. But here, near the end of the transition, they are themselves the inertia taking it over the finish line, still passively, but now in the right direction. Well, that about wraps up the story of the transition. Now you might ask, where were the libertarian and anarchist activists in this story? To be honest, I'm not sure. In my speculations, I used the real-world evidence of history, the real-world evidence of today. I've used insights from psychology, reason, and common sense. I've focused on the overall large trends. So no, the activists, in or out of politics, do not seem to have played a part. And yet, a free society will plausibly emerge. I won't say libertarians and anarchists have no role. If they do, it would be to speed things along a path we're already on. How much they can speed things up, I don't know. But we have to acknowledge the almost polar opposite side of the libertarian coin, where the libertarians did step up to the plate and big time. They gave us the foundational scholarly work that started around the 1970s and continues to this day. That work will help smooth out the transition operationally. The legal frameworks of private courts and contracts will get incorporated into our lives. Private security, rights theory, and property theory will not have to start from scratch. All that libertarian work will pay off as the transition rubber hits the road to be leveraged to smooth out the operational details of the state backing off. So on that note, we'll finish up for today. My plan is to devote an episode to summarizing all the white pills we've uncovered, and also talk more about today's libertarians and anarchists' role in the efforts towards freedom. Those topics should be a fun and interesting way to wrap up this Myth of Authority series. But till then, take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.